Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Capital Modernization Consultation Summary Information Session for BC Credit Unions. My name is Christina Panaggio. I'm a Stakeholder Engagement Specialist here at BCFSA. I'll get us started and situated with some pointers about the format of this Zoom webinar session. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. Depending on the amount of questions, we may finish early. Your microphones have been muted and you are in listen-only mode. Similarly, you will not be able be on camera the entire time. At the bottom of your screen, you will see two icons, the chat function and the Q&A function. Please, you are welcome to use the chat function to send a note to us, the panelists, on today's call. If you have any technical issues with Zoom, Q&A function, this is where you can submit your questions. Please don't use the chat function for that. Again, as you are in listen-only mode, your questions will need to be typed into the Q&A. A reminder that there will be time at the end of the presentation for the question and answer period. You can select to submit questions anonymously, and we will try to address them. If we're unable to address a question and you haven't selected anonymously, we'll try to get back to you by email. Finally, we will be recording today's session, and it will be available on the website as soon as possible. Next slide. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations people, who have been stewards of this land, which we all call home, for many generations. While we meet today on a virtual platform, many of us are in different locations throughout the province, and I would like to encourage you to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the traditional territory you are calling from. And next slide. Our speakers today are J.F. Tremblay. He's our Senior Vice President of Supervision and Deposit Insurance. We have Derek Lau on the call, Vice President of Supervision and Deposit Insurance, and Rebecca Lowry, our Director of Reporting and Standards. Next slide. And just to run through the agenda quickly, we will have a project overview. Our speakers today will go through the highlights of the capital framework, review some of the consultation feedback themes, review some of the key changes they made based on the feedback, what's next, and at the end, like I said, we will have time for a Q&A session. So I'll pass it on to J.F. Tremblay, our Senior Vice President of Supervision, to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you all for joining us today. I intend to cover three perspectives during my prepared remarks, covering the first two agenda items showed here. First, where we're at on our journey to modernize the credit union's regulatory capital regime in BC, because the publication of our report this week is certainly a key milestone, but it's not the end of the road for Cap Mod, as we like to informally call it. Secondly, I will also want to remind stakeholders of the steps we've taken to consult broadly, to gather intelligence and arrive at the decisions that you see in the report today. And then thirdly, I will want to provide a 10,000-foot altitude overview of the enhancements that the BCFSA will be introducing as part of this modernization. Next slide, please. The Capital Modernization Project is a multi-year initiative to modernize BC's capital framework. The publication this week of the consultation summary report marks the end of phase 2. This is the most substantial and meaningful phase of the 4 we've planned. Step 1 started with our internal work, which consisted in benchmarking the current framework against international standards and best practices among credit union regulators. This led to the release of our discussion paper in 2022. That paper then set the stage for phase 2, which was an extensive consultation that lasted from late 2022 until 2024. In fact, we received comments until as recently as the month of May of this year. With the publication of the report, we're now clearly communicating the destination we're aiming for. And now that what we're aiming for is clear, who will move on to phases 3 and 4 to execute on those reforms. This means developing rules and regulations, but also to implement transitional steps that will allow for smooth onboarding and operationalization. Can we go to the next slide, please? The BCFSA's approach to updating the credit union's capital framework has been multifaceted and iterative and integrated, as this slide shows. As mentioned earlier, we did our homework by conducting our own assessment of the credit union segment, and we benchmarked those findings against other jurisdictions and best practices. We then conducted consultations and took on board the input from external stakeholders, that is from industry, from other regulators, academics, etc. We took that knowledge back to what we call our lab, and we've designed what we concluded was the best way to achieve our multiple and sometimes competing objectives. And on that, you probably won't be surprised to hear that our 3 primary objectives have been safety and soundness of the credit unions, the system stability and public confidence, and thirdly, competitivity of the segment relative to other commercial financial services providers. To validate our preliminary conclusions, we also hired external consultants who are experts on the various components of the regime to work alongside our own experts to share perspective and make sure we were attuned to international standards, but also to the unique characteristics of BC credit unions. If we could go to the next slide. And from the start of the process, I want to emphasize that BCFSA has been committed to conducting a transparent process open to input from market participants. We've held extensive consultations, and we've been rewarded by a strong engagement from all categories of stakeholders, I must say. So thank you. Without those steps and without the time you took to engage, we would not have struck the balance that you will find in our modernized framework. Sessions started in late 2022 and early 2023, when we signaled our intention to make adjustments to the framework in areas such as capital composition, credit risk, operational risk, capital buffers, leverage ratio, market risks. We published our consultation documents and findings on our website to make it easier to follow our thinking and the evolution of our proposals. And we developed and provided credit unions with a self-assessment tool to help them better understand whether and how they might be affected by the specific proposals we have. So again, thank you from all of us for your time, your collaborative mindset, and your insights. And please keep that up, as we will need your continued attention as we move to the final phases of the project. In terms of immediate next steps, and they are illustrated in light blue on this slide, let me flag that we're announcing today some changes to the commercial lending framework that will take effect as soon as this summer. We're also planning a transitional bridge to transition from the current framework to the new one. There are things like parallel runs that will happen before the effective date of January 2026. And there will be transitional arrangements for some requirement to be phased in over 3 years after the effective date. I'll let Rebecca provide the details around these arrangements. If we now could move to the next section. I'll just provide some highlights of the capital framework before I pass it on to Derek. Next slide, please. What I simply want to draw your attention to here is that one could see our recommended amendments to the current regime as belonging to either the group of adjustment introduced to strengthen the capital requirements, which are summarized on this slide, and other adjustments aiming at tailoring the framework to reflect some of the unique features of credit unions, which I will show on the next slide. So here we say that to boost safety and soundness, we're taking measures to improve the quality of capital to ensure that it is loss absorbing. We're making changes to the calculations base to look at the group as a whole, the group that we supervise as a whole, and consider the benefits and risk of subsidiaries, which we didn't do before. We're gradually requiring more capital, admittedly, and we've introduced a mechanism to replenish capital in a timely manner after depletion, if that occurs. And on the next slide, my last slide, we note here that we've taken into account the member-based structure of credit unions, gave credit to the cushion of funds raised via member shares, for instance. Similarly, we've introduced a new approach and new flexibility to determine the eligibility of some instruments, some financial instruments as Tier 1 or Tier 2, depending on the features of the instrument, as opposed to the simplistic approach of saying member shares yes and other instruments no. As you will also see later in the process, we've tweaked the risk weights on some asset categories to reflect provincial realities. For instance, the prevalence of small and medium businesses in local communities, or of multi-residential units in the Greater Vancouver area. And to give another example, we've heard you also, small credit unions, and the need to give you a bit more time to make internal adjustments. And we've extended the transitional period compared with our original proposal. Now, I'll pass it on to Derek and Rebecca, who will get into a bit more detail. But I also want to remind you before that this webinar is meant to be an introduction to the report and not an exhaustive and systematic review of every decision. There are no less than 34 changes identified in the report. We will give you during this presentation the gist of the changes being proposed, but we will not cover them all one by one. But we hope that the context and the color we're providing today will make your reading and understanding of the report easier. Thank you for your attention, and to you, Derek.
Thank you, JF. So in this section, I will be speaking to feedback themes. Next slide, please. Since the publication of the Capital Modernization Consultation Paper in July 2023, BCFSA has received wide-ranging feedback through working groups, information sessions, and a public consultations. As a result of the extensive consultation, BCFSA has heard feedback on a variety of themes, including challenges in implementing the new framework, concerns that the new framework may result in competitive disadvantages, as well as other items, which I'll speak to a bit more. Credit unions also emphasize the need for transitional arrangements in this more difficult macroeconomic environment. Overall, the credit union system supports and endorses the initiative of modernizing the capital framework in BC, which is more than 30 years old. As indicated in JF's remarks, a modern capital framework strengthens the confidence and stability of the BC credit union system. So let's take a deeper dive into some specific themes. Next slide, please. Concerns were noted regarding the potential competitive disadvantages associated with the capital modernization framework, and in particular around credit risk. We all acknowledge that BC credit unions face unique risk, and a tailored specific approach is needed when determining the loan portfolio risk weightings pertaining to credit risk. This is because all BC credit unions have a high concentration of lending tied to real estate in both retail and commercial portfolios. The real estate market is cyclical with a certain level of volatility, and there are affordability challenges due to high housing prices here in BC. This all impacts the ability of borrowers to service the loans. As a result, it is prudent to introduce specific risk metrics for residential and commercial real estate exposures. Capturing these exposures in the capital adequacy calculation has been crucial to the design of the framework. We aim to balance competitive viability and prudent risk management. Next slide, please. Respondents noted concerns about the costs and resources relating to the collection of additional data fields and system upgrades to comply with CapMod. BCFSA acknowledges that credit unions will have to collect additional data fields and that certain lending processes will need to be revamped to meet the implementation of CapMod. Beyond using these data fields to comply with CapMod, these additional data fields would be useful for the proactive risk management monitoring by the credit union itself. We also focus on only needing the minimum number of additional data fields as part of this project. Respondents were also concerned about the impact of their reputation from the expected lower capital adequacy ratios resulting from CapMod. For capital risk management, we need to have a capital adequacy ratio that is truly accurate in being able to absorb losses in times of stress. This is better than the alternative of having a higher capital adequacy figure, which is not effective in absorbing losses during a stress event. Regarding transitional measures to support the adjustment period, Rebecca will speak more on that at a later slide. Next slide, please. Regarding instances when a credit union's capital falls below the capital conservation buffer, Within the summary report released on Monday, we outlined specific business and/or operational constraints when capital falls below the capital conservation buffer. In developing these constraints, we benchmarked against other jurisdictions and general risk management best practices. Regarding the existing ICAP guideline that was published in 2018, BCFSA notes that with the introduction of CapMod, certain components of the existing guideline will no longer be aligned. Therefore, in 2025, we plan to draft and publish a revised ICAP guideline that fully aligns to CapMod. In addition, we will consider adjusting for any more modern capital risk management practices as part of the update of this document. It is also likely that all credit unions will be expected to complete an ICAP. Of course, we will consider proportionality in this expectation. Next slide, please. Regarding alignment with the QDIC assessment, QDIC will assess the impact of the new capital framework on its differential premium system once the capital rule is in place. Adjustments are expected to be made to DPS to ensure alignment with CapMod. Regarding market risk, for this phase of CapMod, there will be no Pillar 1 charge for market risk. We plan to further assess market risk in the summer or fall of this year and will hold a public information session on this topic. As part of this assessment, we plan to conduct a quantitative impact study to better understand the impact that market risk has on capital. Finally, with respect to the exclusion of system capital, it is very clear that this form of capital is not loss absorbing in times of stress. We feel strongly in our position that the removal of system capital from day one is the correct treatment to ensure a safe and sound BC credit union system. In the next section, I will pass it on to Rebecca that will be discussing more in depth some of the key changes in the Monday paper released. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Next slide, please. So thank you, Derek, for providing an overview of what we heard from credit unions through the consultation process. Today, I'm going to take some time to dive a little deeper and highlight some of the changes that we have made to the capital framework as a result of the consultation and engagement with credit unions over the past year. In particular, we have provided some additional clarification in how we are risk weighting some specific exposures, aligning to Basel III frameworks for claims on sovereigns, PSEs, deposit-taking FIs, etc. And you can find more details on those items in item 20 of the consultation summary report. This report was issued on Monday of this week. That was sent out by email to the credit unions, and you can find a link to that on our Capital Modernization page on our website as well. So please feel free to take a look at that for more details. We have also introduced some thresholds in response to some specific feedback received from credit unions in Central One, following the spirit of Basel III. So in particular, we've introduced a threshold on the investment in non-significant and significant investments. And you'll be able to find more details on that under item 1 of the summary report. We've also adopted and introduced a threshold approach for deferred tax assets. And more details can be found on that under item 2 of the summary report. Next slide, please. We've also introduced some changes to the credit risk section of the capital framework. In particular, we have introduced some BC-specific criteria for small-sized business loans under the regulatory retail portfolio. We have expanded the criteria for the regulatory retail portfolio and allowed a preferential risk weighting for business and personal lending that falls beneath a specified threshold. And this threshold will range from 100,000 to 1.5 million, depending on the size of a credit union and their lending portfolio. And you'll be able to see the details on those criteria and those thresholds in item 20.3 of the summary report. In response to feedback from participants, we also introduced some principles for the capital treatment of repurchase agreements and covered bonds. And more details on those can be found in items 12 and 13 of the summary report. We have also made an update to our treatment of HELOCs, home equity lines of credit, to better align with term mortgages. The details on that can be found in item 14. We have also made adjustments to commercial lending. We've provided some additional clarification on the commercial lending categories, and item 17 outlines those in the summary report itself. And we've adjusted the risk weight for speculative land financing. That can be found in item 17.3. And we're introducing a streamlined approach to general commercial lending. And that can be found in item 18 of the summary report. Next slide, please. As Derek discussed earlier, we heard feedback from credit union participants regarding the challenges to implement the new capital framework. In response to this feedback, BCFSA took those transitional arrangements that we had originally proposed, we took those back to the table and are introducing a more comprehensive set of transitional arrangements, and the details of those can be found in the summary report, and that's outlined in items 28 to 34 of the report. Next slide. So in particular, to allow BC credit unions more time to meet the capital modernization requirements, BCFSA has extended the transition date by 1 year and will be phasing in the capital ratio requirements over a 3-year transitional period as opposed to the original 2-year period. You can find more details on this under item 28 of the paper, as well as outlined in Appendix B to the summary report. You will also notice that we'll be holding off on the implementation of a couple of the deductions from capital as well. So the deduction of software intangibles and non-significant investments in financials. We have held on, and we will be pushing back the deduction of those to year 3 of our transitional arrangements. And details on that can be found in item 34 of the summary report. Next slide, please. Through the course of the consultation, we also had specific feedback requesting the implementation of parallel reporting. And so it was requested that we introduce this to support the transition for credit unions to the new framework. In response to this feedback, BCFSA will be providing a self-assessment tool, and this will be released in fall of 2025, followed by an information session. This self-assessment tool will give the credit unions the tools to support the transition to the new capital rule and better manage the work to align with the new framework, preventing any surprises on implementation. We will be working with the credit unions to submit those self-assessments starting in early 2025, January 2025. We will introduce some proportionality on the reporting frequency using that assessment tool for the smaller credit unions, and more details on that can be found in item 32 of the summary report. Next slide, please. In addition to these transitional arrangements, we will also be introducing an interim measure starting in July of this year in anticipation of the new capital rule. So currently, our capital regulation applies an incremental 50 points to any commercial lending that exceeds 30% of total assets. This interim measure will raise that 30% threshold to 35% and maintain the risk weight of 100% up to that new threshold. And you can see the details of that in the table below. And the interim measure risk weights are outlined on the far right column. Those interim measure risk weights will be effective July 1st, and we will be issuing an advisory on this specifically later today. With the introduction of this interim measure, we are encouraging credit unions to start looking at their lending portfolios, looking at their credit risk processes and policies, etc., and start spending the time in anticipation of that more risk-based commercial lending risk weights and looking to balance those portfolios and take a forward-looking view of lending. Next slide, please. So what's next for the credit unions? Next slide. We are looking forward over the next few months, and we do expect to continue to engage with the credit unions. In June 2024, we published our consultation summary report, and that was published on Monday, June 24th. We've had our information session today, and we've started the work to start drafting the actual rule itself as a result of this. We will continue to hold additional information sessions as needed, in particular on our self-assessment tool, on market risk coming late summer, early fall, etc. We'll be working with the credit unions and look forward to hearing additional questions as they arise through our credit CU Capital email address, and we'll also be looking forward in spring of 2025 for additional consultations. In spring of 2025, you can expect to get more information on the reporting template consultation, as well as the ICAP consultation. And as Derek mentioned, we will be updating our ICAP guide in 2025. So more to come on that. We thank all the credit unions for your continued engagement as we've moved through this process, and we look forward to continuing that as we move into the next phase of the project. So with that in mind, if we can move to the next slide, we're going to open it up for questions. And as outlined at the very beginning of the session here, we are utilizing the Q&A function in Zoom. It'll be down at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage participants to submit their questions using that tool. We also have our CU Capital email address available. You can see that on the screen here. And please feel free, if you have a question after the session, to contact us, reach out. Okay. So looking at our Q&A function tool here, we do have a question regarding the update to the regulatory retail portfolio. And specifically, we've been asked, what does BC specific mean, and can you elaborate on that change? So for this one particularly, the change was referring to small-sized lending for businesses and individuals in BC. Some examples would be personal loans and leases, but also we've expanded that to include business loans as well. And this is really looking to apply a lower risk weight if certain criteria are met under that $1.5 million threshold. And that threshold will vary depending on the size of the credit unions. You can find more in the summary report itself. That's item 20.3. So this really looks to support that line of lending and to grow that within the credit unions. I'm actually going to pass this over to Derek to talk a little bit more about this change.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. Through our supervision lens, and recently we've met, I believe, all of you through the credit union supervision tour. Many credit unions have an ambition to continue to or increase the servicing of members in this small business category of lending. So when we set the risk weights, we had a lot of discussions benchmarked against other jurisdictions and best practices in risk management, but we took a very balanced approach in looking at competitiveness, looking at, many of you know your communities, your members. So we had to set an appropriate risk rating that reflects that risk, but we benchmarked, looked at best practices, and took, I would say, a very balanced approach in the continuum of those two elements and in coming up with what you have, as Rebecca noted, in 20.3 of the summary report for more details on that. So have a look at that, and happy to engage more on that.
Thank you, Derek. Okay, next question. This is a comment from one of the credit unions stating that they think the credit unions will still face some competitive hurdles to compete against banks and other FIs. Small credit unions in particular may find this new framework challenging. I'm going to pass this one over to JF to address.
Yeah, happy to take that. Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. There's a bit of an overlap with the previous answer, I think. We needed to balance competing objectives. We cannot compromise safety and soundness to give a competitive edge to credit union. This would be quite short-sighted in my view. And one of the best and most basic ways to compete and attract customers is in fact to instill confidence. And one of the ways to do that is by having a strong financial profile and showing evidence of resilience capacity. Also, admittedly, we were aiming to make the framework broadly neutral from a competitive standpoint, with some tweaks where we could to capture the unique features or implementation challenges that credit unions could face, as you're pointing out in your remark. For instance, as mentioned during our prepared remarks, we have heard that small credit unions wanted a bit more time to gradually onboard the new requirements after the effective date. And it's more than 4 years of transitional bridge if you add 1 year of parallel runs that will start in 2025 that we're essentially providing. So we were very careful in considering the implications of that. And perhaps to answer the question even more comprehensively, I'd like to add that the credit unions face strong competition from commercial banks, and there are aspects other than capital that we would need to get into to do justice to the comment and the point about competition. But those aspects are outside of this report clearly and the webinar. Whether it's technology and how to attract younger members, how to attract a greater share of wallets of their members, these are important aspects and factors to talk about or think about, but they're not capital matters. So we'll leave them out for today. That's all I would say on that, Rebecca.
Thank you, Jaya. Okay, so we also had a question about transition. So this question is asking about the when are we live and how that fits with the parallel reporting that we're implementing. So for some additional clarity, we will be implementing this rule January 2026, and we will be following a 3-year transition period. And during that time, we'll be stepping up the requirement for CAR over the course of those 3 years. So we will be starting out with that total capital requirement at 8% and stepping that up in increments over the course of 3 years to the 10.5%, including a capital buffer. So that will be in place for January 2029 at 10.5%. So that will go live, the new rules, January 2026, with that gradual step in place for the total capital requirements. So I hope that clears up that part of the question. The question had 2 parts. The next part was about the parallel reporting. So to be clear, the parallel reporting is going to be introduced in advance of the actual rule itself. And so we're going to be starting parallel reporting in 2025. And we're looking to get that, really support the credit unions as they prepare for that January 2026 go live date. And we are still asking the credit unions to report as per usual, business as usual, on our current capital regulations, the current CRR, during that 2025 year. But we will also be looking to ask the credit unions to use the self-assessment tool to start assessing their capital and their readiness during that process. So that parallel reporting period is actually the 12 months leading up to implementation date of January 2026. You can find more about that in the summary report itself on that parallel reporting. We will be looking to introduce some proportionality on that. So we're going to be asking the larger credit unions to do this exercise on a quarterly basis, with the smaller credit unions doing that less frequently during the time. I hope that answered your question on that one. We also have a question surrounding market risk, and in particular asking about with Pillar 1 not being part of this initial launch. And so a little bit more information on this. So we have not included a Pillar 1 capital charge as part of our capital rule going live January 2026. In terms of the interest rate risk on the banking book, which was part of the question being asked, right now we will be focused on taking that into account as we update ICAP. So that will be included in our ICAP guideline process, looking at that interest rate risk on the banking book. And we'll be addressing it through ICAP at this point in time. We will also be working to do some additional work in that quantitative impact study. We'll be having an information session on that late summer, early fall, and we'll be doing that over the course of 12 months. And we're going to be looking at this on a quarterly basis for 4 to 5 quarters. And looking to really understand the impact of market risk on credit unions. And we're going to be looking at the interest rate risk on the banking book, but also trading, the trading book as well. And this doesn't impact a lot of credit unions. This will be very specific. We'll be holding some specific sessions and working group sessions with the credit unions, Central One, etc., that may potentially be impacted by some of these things, as well as some general information sessions on the interest rate risk in the banking book. But like I said, this is going to be a bit longer process. We're going to be doing this quantitative impact study over 4 to 5 quarters to better understand it. And then looking forward from there, we'll be doing some additional consultation. So I hope that that answers your question. Okay, just going through the questions here. Okay, we've addressed the market risk one, sorry. So we did have a question. The summary report was released on Monday. Folks may not have had enough time to read it, come up with some questions on this. So in response to that question, I do encourage you to take a look at the summary report. Please feel free to reach out to us directly at the email address here. We will also be working with CCUA to do a bit of a pulse check after this session, and we can determine at that point if additional information sessions are needed, and we'll be reaching out and providing additional information that way. Okay. So we're getting quite a lot of questions now. So I just do want to take 1 second to note that we may not get through all of them in this session today. If we don't get to your question today, don't worry, we will respond via email following the session. If you are asking that question as an anonymous attendee, I do ask you to please reach out to our email address following the session so that we can follow up with you. And we will answer all these questions, even if we can't get them to all of them in today's session. Okay, going through the question. So the next question, we had a question about what will BCFSA do if credit unions are not able to meet new capital adequacy requirements due to economic conditions or other changes. I'm going to pass that question over to Derek.
Yep, no, thank you, Rebecca. Great question. So with the introduction of parallel reporting, the expectation is that all BC credit unions would comply with the new requirements according to the transitional timeline provided in the summary report. But we understand that there are certain institutions that may be close to the line or are not able to meet the capital adequacy requirements on that table. In those instances, supervision will work with those institutions on a bespoke basis and hold and get a bit of further understanding on where that stress is occurring. In particular, we will work with those institutions to develop adequate capital risk mitigation plans to eventually bridge that shortfall over time. During that period, we would also expect management as well as the board to increase governance and effective oversight and challenge over the capital support factor. So I think the parallel reporting is going to be key, because you'll have capital, the way I see it, it's a slow moving glacier. It's one of those where you'll know well ahead of time, or you should be able to, with proper capital forecasting, with projections, to know where you're at. And then let's have that discussion early on, and not take a surprise approach as we get closer to that date. And then to the extent you're close or under, let's discuss bespoke capital contingency and risk mitigation plans to get there. So thank you.
Thank you, Derek, for answering that one. So our next question is, it was asked if this webinar and presentation will be available to you at a later date. And yes, this presentation is being recorded, and we will be posting it to the Capital Modernization Project webpage as soon as it is available. We will also be sending out a PDF of the slides to all participants after this session as well. So that will be available. Okay. Next question, we have another question on market risk. And so this question is asking us to elaborate a little bit more on market risk. And they're asking in particular to share the rationale for a potential capital charge on market risk, since credit unions' exposure is mostly in the MLP pools and has been addressed in ICAP. So with this one, the credit unions are exposed to market risk through the mandatory liquidity pool instruments held for trading or hedging positions, as well as through the principal business of a duration mismatch between lending and deposit taking. So just to reiterate, this phase of CapMod, we will not be including a Pillar 1 charge for market risk, and we will be exploring this in the future for future capital rule amendments. I'm actually going to see if Derek has anything else to add on this one.
No, I think you pretty much covered it, Rebecca. Like, more to come on this in the summer. We get that in the current environment where interest rates rapidly increase and there's volatility in this area. It's a key risk item that we're currently dealing with through bespoke supervision, as well as looking at the balance sheet structure. We encourage credit unions in the meantime within your ICAP really to take a hard look at this measure, ensuring you're measuring that appropriately. Throughout the summer, winter, I think covered through one of the slides, we're going to be doing that quantitative impact study. Many of the credit unions, it's really the duration mismatch and the MLP pool that Rebecca mentioned, and very few have that trading book in that market risk. So I think this is sort of a bolt-on to a future phase within capital modernization, and then for this phase, as Rebecca noted, will not be covered in that Pillar 1, but look at it in ICAP, and more to come on this as part of CapMod as sort of that bolt-on second phase. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Derek. Okay. We have some very specific questions being asked as well. One particular question, can you please elaborate on residential assets under hold companies? Are we on track to follow similar OSFI 20 guidelines? Oh, sorry, etc. So can you, to clarify on this, for existing borrowers, we are looking to categorize these as risk weights for claims on corporates. You can find more details on this actually on page 43 in Appendix D of the consultation summary report. For all current performing loans with existing borrowers within the commercial portfolio, we considered risk weights to correspond with risk factors of the credit's assessments as unrated. So for the person asking these questions, I encourage you to go take a look at our summary report, Appendix D on page 43. Thank you for the question. We've also been asked, when will we be getting the final data requirements so that our lending teams can start requesting this data? So if you take a look at the consultation summary that we released last summer, along with the summary report in combination. So look, if you take those, that will give you a good overview. We will also be releasing a self-assessment tool along with an associated guide coming in fall. And that self-assessment tool is going to look very similar to your current reporting templates. We'll be following a similar look and feel to the current capital reporting templates. And that will actually break down the data requirements, how to report, etc. So in the short term, I recommend taking a look at both documents, the consultation document from last summer, as well as our summary report. And coming in fall, we'll be providing quite a bit of detail as part of that self-assessment tool. Okay, looking through the questions again. So we also had a question regarding reporting and data. And so in this question, one of the participants asked, the capital adequacy reporting relies on credit unions having the data to prepare returns, even during parallel reporting. What is BCFSA's perspective if the credit unions report on risk weights that may rely, say, on 50% reliable data? So the data quality isn't quite there yet, is how I'm interpreting this question. And so some of the TDS, for example, data, some of those specific data points to risk weight the lending portfolios aren't there. What is BCFSA's approach to that? So thank you for that question. I think that that's an important one. We've talked about that as part of both the working group process as well as in past information sessions through the consultation. And BCFSA is really looking to support the credit unions as they grow and develop the data quality within the data to report on this. This is one of the reasons we are introducing parallel reporting. We want to support the credit unions to get there. We understand that if there may be some loans that don't have that data, and that will be built up over time. In that case, we will be providing some additional principles around that as part of the reporting and part of that self-assessment tool. So that will be included in that guide that's attached to the self-assessment tool in the fall. As discussed at past sessions, we are asking you to take a conservative approach. So if you are missing a TDS, please use a conservative approach at this point in time, knowing that that data quality will improve over time. This is another reason why we've also introduced that 3-year transitional period. So with that in mind, the parallel reporting, the additional 3 years, we are hoping to support the credit unions as they build that data quality and that data reporting capability internally. But as I said, more information to come on the reporting side as well. Okay, I'm reading through the remaining of the questions, and some of them are quite specific. So we're going to hold off on answering some of the very, very specific and credit union specific questions, and we'll reach out to those individual credit unions, and we'll provide some additional information on this following the session today. So thank you, everyone, for your engagement. Thank you for all the questions we've received today and for attending our information session. As I mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded and will be available to listen to and watch again on our website. We will be sending out additional information following the session. You can hear from us on market risk, the parallel reporting, etc., in the coming months. And please feel free to reach out directly with any additional questions. Thank you, everyone.